Hello, my name is Bill Coughlin, and welcome to First Person Civil War Podcast, which retells the stories of the soldiers and officers on the ground in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 22, a special episode, is entitled Captain Goldsborough and the 1st Maryland face Private Bicknell and the 5th Maine at the Battle of First Manassas, and relies on two books: The Maryland Line in the Confederate States Army, published in 1869 by William W. Goldsborough, and History of the 5th Regiment, Maine Volunteers, published in 1871 by George W. Bicknell. To follow along exactly where on the battlefield the 1st Maryland and the 5th Maine faced each other, I recommend the American Battlefield Trust's maps of First Manassas, also known as First Bull Run. William W. Goldsborough lived in Baltimore before the war began and was a member of the Baltimore City Guard Battalion, which was the local militia. Following the 19 April 1861 Baltimore riot, when the 1st Northern Regiments on their way to Washington, D.C., had to fight their way through the city streets, and with more and more Northern regiments set to pass through the city, many in the militia battalion who wanted to fight for the South had to make a choice, including William Goldsborough. He attended a battalion meeting where many of the men spoke about fighting for the Confederacy. "The thing is up, boys," said Dr. Harry Scott, "and now we begin to see who is who. All seemed mighty anxious for a fight last Sunday, and how hard those who were most violent at first are now striving to prove themselves the most loyal men in Baltimore. For my part, I am going south to join the Confederate Army." According to William Goldsborough, 20 men volunteered on the spot. George W. Bicknell lived in Portland, Maine, before the war began, and just like others in towns north and south, the firing on Fort Sumter motivated him to enlist. Youth and maturity seemed consecrated to the work of repelling the rebellious intruder and of wiping out the stain upon the national flag. Companies, battalions, regiments seemed to leap into being in a moment, ready for action. George W. Bicknell does not give exact dates when he joined a company of infantry that formed in Portland and drilled for an undisclosed amount of time. On 24 June 1861, alongside 9 other companies, 2 of which from Portland as well, the 5th Maine officially mustered into service. Private Bicknell was now in Company H of the regiment. On 25 June, the 5th Maine departed Portland by rail, bound for Washington, D.C. Private Bicknell does not say when the regiment passed through Baltimore, but noted the tension in the city as the 5th Maine marched through it. Muskets were loaded and capped, and amid mighty crowds, the command moved through the city. No disturbance took place, however, though it was easy to perceive the burning desire of the semi-secesh to exterminate the intruding mudsills. William Goldsborough was by this time already in Virginia. 40 men, including him, left Baltimore on 7 May for Richmond. Men from across Maryland coalesced there and were enough to fill 3 companies. To complete the formation of the regiment, the companies traveled west to Winchester, Virginia, where even more Maryland companies formed. The 1st Maryland completed organization in June, composed of 9 companies of approximately 700 men. Now a captain, William W. Goldsborough commanded Company A. Throughout early July, the 1st Maryland was assigned to the 4th Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Edmund K. Smith, in the Army of the Shenandoah, commanded by General Joseph E. Johnston. This force was tasked with stopping the Union Army under General Patterson from marching further into the Shenandoah Valley. After taking Harper's Ferry and fighting the Battle of Hoke's Run, General Patterson halted his advance and eventually withdrew. The 1st Maryland, along with the rest of the Army of the Shenandoah, took the Manassas Gap Railroad to link up with the Confederate Army of the Potomac at Manassas Junction. The sun rose next day bright and beautiful, and the scene that presented itself as we responded to reveille was animated indeed. The troops were eagerly crowding into the cars, prepared to convey them to the battlefield. And from the boisterous mirth to be heard on all sides, one would have supposed them on their way to participate in some grand holiday parade instead of scenes of death and carnage. The engineers of 2 of the trains that moved the Confederates east happened to be from the north and attempted to crash 2 of the trains together, thereby delaying the transfer of troops. Captain Goldsborough says that these men were successful in destroying one train on 20 July. To complicate matters even further, the train carrying the 4th Brigade also broke down on the morning of 21 July, the day of the battle. Captain Goldsborough and the 1st Maryland had no choice but to wait for the first train to turn around and bring them to Manassas Junction, which they arrived at 1 p.m. After spending several days in Washington, D.C., including the 4th of July, Private Bicknell and the 5th Maine received orders on 9 July to occupy Alexandria, which is just across the Potomac River from the capital. From there, the regiment conducted reconnaissance of the countryside for several miles around the city. By 16 July, Private Bicknell and the 5th Maine departed their camp and assumed a march further into Virginia. The 5th Maine marched in the 3rd Brigade, commanded by Colonel Oliver O. Howard, and Colonel Samuel P. Heintzelman's 3rd Division, in Brigadier General Irvin McDowell's Army of Northeastern Virginia. The march was slow going and at times contested by Confederates. The 5th Maine, while on an early afternoon halt, suddenly received an order to double quick to aid a Massachusetts regiment which had been ambushed. But the Confederates seemed to withdraw without much of a fight. By 19 July, Private Bicknell and the 5th Maine arrived at Centerville, Virginia, along with the rest of the army. The Battle of First Manassas began on the morning of 21 July, 1861, but Private Bicknell and the 5th Maine, who marched out of the Centerville camp in the early morning, were not immediately thrown into the fight. Distinctly to our ears came the sound of the conflict, yet Howard's brigade remained. Impatience was everywhere visible, yet we must obey orders. The sun seemed to pour down his most sweltering rays. Not even a cloud dotted the sky, nor breath of wind to fan our brows. And he continues, 9, 10 o'clock, and yet we remained in the same position, wondering what detained us. In the distance, we could see the glistening bayonets moving across the plains, could hear the peal of artillery, and the sharp, quick reports of musketry. Soon an orderly dashes up, and the order, 5th Maine, fall in, was responded with a will and readiness, indicative of our former impatience. The 5th Maine marched at the double quick toward the battlefield, and it was a long enough distance that this march alone reduced the combat effectiveness of the regiment. Colonel Mark H. Dunnell, commander of the 5th Maine, dedicates most of his report after the battle on how many men fell out of the regiment before it even got on the field. The rapid movement of our men for many miles before the commencement of the action completely unfitted them for the labor of the action. none but an immediate eyewitness can fully realize the real sufferings of the men during the march. The best, stoutest, and bravest men failed and fell by the roadside. 2 company commanders and 5 out of 12 lieutenants also fell out of this run to the battlefield, and companies E and I had no officers in the ranks at all. Using the Manassas-Sudley Road, Private Bicknell and the 5th Maine ran toward the fighting that was now around Henry Hill. On we ran, till suddenly a cannonball, striking within a few feet of the head of the regiment, gave us the understanding that we were within range. The regiment departed the road and into a field, and he continues, "Whiz! A man is struck immediately in our front, torn by a solid shot. It was not 1:30 that we were formed into line of battle. Under the cover of a hill, our regiment halted, and the officers attempted to form our line. The 5th Maine, alongside the rest of their brigade, formed on Chinn Ridge at approximately 3 p.m. and faced Bald Hill, on the right flank of the Union Army. While most of the fighting centered on Henry Hill, both armies began feeding brigades to these locations. Captain Goldsborough and the 1st Maryland found themselves marching toward Bald Hill. The 1st Maryland had the right of the line, at the head of which was riding General Kirby Smith. We were still marching by the flank when, just as the column entered a strip of woods, it was fired upon by about a dozen of the 14th Brooklyn Zouaves, and the general fell from his horse, shot through the neck. The regiment, as did the brigade, formed line of battle instinctively, and, not knowing what might be the enemy's force, prepared for an attack. A Colonel Elsie took command, and he continues. After waiting some minutes, and the enemy not appearing, moved the brigade obliquely through the woods to the left and front, and as we approached its edge, the Federal line of battle appeared in view. Directly across from the 1st Maryland was Private Bicknell and the 5th Maine, in line with their brigade. We moved up the hill, taking a position on the summit. Here we were greeted with a shower of bullets, and we were ordered to fire. Fire at what? About 500 yards in our front was a belt of woods, though not a Johnny in sight. Into this wood we poured our volleys, though wholly ignorant whether our efforts were of any use or not. But still, we worked with a will. Smoke on the battlefield may explain why Private Bicknell could not see the Confederates, but his leadership, possibly at a better vantage point, did see them, and ordered the regiment to open fire. Captain Goldsborough and the 1st Maryland were in the woods on Bald Hill, and received the 5th Maine's musket fire. As they perceived us, poured into our ranks a terrific volley of musketry that took effect upon several of the men of the brigade. Private John Swisher of Company A, 1st Maryland, fell from a musket ball in the head and died soon after, being the first man from Maryland killed in the actual battle. Colonel Elsie immediately prepared to attack. Holding the 13th Virginia in reserve, he formed the 1st Maryland, 10th Virginia, and 3rd Tennessee, and under cover of a hot fire from the Newtown battery of light artillery, ordered a charge. Private Bicknell and the rest of the 5th Maine continued to fire at the 1st Maryland. Everyone was desirous of doing his whole duty, a special illustration of which was seen in the action of a captain firing his revolver at a battery at least 3/4 of a mile distant. Here we were, probably in full view of the enemy, while not one of their infantry was to be seen. Remarkable strategy, yet I have no doubt the woods were well bombarded. We could see our own batteries wheeling off in the distance. Yet, in our own simplicity, we deemed it all right and worked on. Though still under direct fire from the 5th Maine, Captain Goldsborough and the 1st Maryland, along with the rest of their brigade, charged. The enemy held a strong position on a ridge difficult of ascent, and immediately in front of a dense pine thicket. At least 300 yards separated us, and the charge was to be across a wheat field, and of course without shelter of any description. It was a desperate undertaking. At the command, with one wild, deafening yell, the Confederates emerged from the woods, and, amidst a perfect storm of bullets, the gallant fellows rushed across the field. But they never wavered nor hesitated, and, dashing up the acclivity, drove the enemy pell-mell from their strong position into the thicket in their rear. Colonel Oliver O. Howard, the brigade commander, recognized that his right, the 5th Maine included, could not hold their position against the charge of the 1st Maryland and several other Confederate regiments, and ordered the right wing to retreat. Soon, this line began to break and fall back, an order for a wing to retire being understood for the whole. Private Bicknell, still holding his position against the 1st Maryland's charge, heard this order and the confusion it brought to the 5th Maine and the rest of the brigade. But what is that? Clear rings the words, "Cease firing, about face, in retreat, march." And now my pen seems like a balloon, soaring at this point, not at once collapsing. Confusion, disorder, seized us at once. How we traveled! Nobody tired now. Everyone for himself, and having due regard for individuality, each gave a special attention to the rapid movement of his legs. As Private Bicknell and the brigade retreated from the battlefield, the Battle of First Manassas, also known as First Bull Run, ended, and the Union Army retreated in confusion back to Washington, D.C. Though smaller engagements came before it, the Battle of First Manassas was the first major engagement of the Civil War, and the belief in a short war ended. President Lincoln, the next day, called for 500,000 volunteers to further prosecute the war, and the Confederacy made a similar call for men. William W. Goldsborough stayed in the 1st Maryland for its one-year enlistment, and following the end of the 7 days' battles outside of Richmond, the regiment disbanded. He published his book entitled The Maryland Line in the Confederate States Army in 1869, which included histories of the 1st and 2nd Maryland Infantry Regiments, the 1st Maryland Battalion of Cavalry, along with several other Maryland formations. William Goldsborough, seemingly chomping at the bit in his dedication, explained why he wrote the book. Almost 4 years have elapsed since the surrender of General Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, and as yet, nothing has been presented to the world to show the prominent part taken in the Great Rebellion by the Sons of Maryland. Thus believing, the author has yielded to the importunities of many of the officers and men of the several commands that composed the young Maryland line, and presents to the public the little book describing briefly the operations during those 4 eventful years. George W. Bicknell became an officer in the 5th Maine in 1862, wounded in the 1863 assault upon Fredericksburg during the Chancellorsville campaign. He was discharged in March of 1864 due to complications from the wound. After the war, a Lieutenant Frank G. Patterson originally decided to write the regimental history, but he died before beginning the work. The men of the regiment then selected George Bicknell to write their history. The work has been written under rather unfavorable circumstances, amid the cares and labors of a large charge, and at times compelled to suspend work from the effects of a wound received in the service. These pages have been somewhat hastily prepared. At 404 pages, George Bicknell still believed the book was only a brief history of the 5th Maine. Thank you for listening to the 22nd episode. The link to William W. Goldsborough's and George W. Bicknell's books are now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a sketch of William W. Goldsborough from his book and a picture of George W. Bicknell, generously provided by the collections of the 5th Maine Museum, Peaks Island, Maine. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a review, follow the podcast on social media, and also consider supporting the podcast by following the link at the top of the website. Just as a reminder, special episodes are not scheduled and will happen when I find accounts of men whose regiments met on the battlefield. Colonel James Cooper Nisbet, commander of the 66th Georgia, provides next week's first-person account at the Battle of Peachtree Creek. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.